Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson. I'm back with Dr. Jonathan Cook as we talk about Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm really excited to talk about this text. I was able to do a fair amount of research beforehand, given that there were a number of articles in the public domain from the JSTOR early journal content, and I've made those available to you on the Noetic teaching platform and app, so you'll be able to dive into those if you like. Dr. Cook, I'd just like to start this session, I guess, by saying how much this book defied my expectations. I had never read Uncle Tom's Cabin before, and I think I had come to see it negatively without having any real knowledge of it. I think before reading it, I think I almost detested it because it's so outsold writers like Hawthorne and Melville. I automatically assumed it was going to just be like some popular claptrap, but it's a really profound and beautiful novel. There were moments when I found myself weeping during the reading of this. I mean, it was, and we'll get into a lot of the reasons why this was so emotionally moving for me, but I thought this was a breathtaking novel, and I've enjoyed so many of the books that we've talked about before, but this one really touched me. I'll elaborate as we go throughout the interview, but I just wanted to say that this is a book I think everyone needs to read.
Yeah, I think when people come to it, they're surprisingly impressed with it. It used to be taught pretty regularly in high schools. I remember my older siblings read it, in high school in the '50s, late '50s, '60s. But it's kind of it's had a real dramatic comeback in the academic world in the '70s and '80s as a novel that was written by a woman and became popular mainly because that kind of fiction was all the rage in the 1850s. Novels that were so-called domestic fiction, written sanctifying the home and paying homage to the important role of women in society, of guardians of moral probity. But as far as the novel goes, I mean, it is very entertaining. Stowe really has a great command of character. She's got a great command of dialect, and she's sympathetic to all of her characters. She has a sort of compassionate view of all of her characters. Even her main villain, Simon Legree, is someone whom we can kind of understand, even though he turns out to be this nasty, evil character who ends up killing Tom. So she was quite adept at characterization. She had a compelling story to tell. She was a passionate anti-slavery advocate, abolitionist.
That was one of the things that struck me most about this text. And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to make the point so I don't forget it, is I think in retrospect, so many of us enlightened individuals take it for granted that there was so much correctness with the anti-slavery abolitionist perspective. But when you read Uncle Tom's Cabin, you realize how much of a zealous minority the abolitionists were. And that resonated with me because I kind of feel myself to be a little bit of a radical zealot about some issues that are very much outside the mainstream. And I guess I felt this communion with Harriet Beecher Stowe for that reason, and that eventually history sort of works its way out towards moral rectitude. But at the time, it was incredibly brave for her to be doing this because there were so many people violently opposed to the anti-slavery movement. They were destroying printing presses and threatening to hang abolitionists. I mean, she really stuck her neck out there for this.
Yeah. I mean, she was living in Cincinnati from 1833 to 1849, and Elijah Lovejoy had his printing press destroyed there, and he was kind of an early martyr to speaking up against slavery. He was actually a friend of Stowe's, one of Stowe's older brothers. So she really knew how sort of dangerous it could be to oppose slavery, but she was a little safer as a woman in that capacity. And people kind of were shocked about the fact that here was this wife of a professor and a minister, Calvin Stowe, who was taking on this incredible role as an advocate against slavery as a woman, because women were supposed to be quiet and docile and obedient to their husbands and whatnot. But here she was coming out so strongly. I mean, she really didn't have much of a history of this before Uncle Tom's Cabin. She was raising her children in Cincinnati with Calvin Stowe. He was a professor there at the local theological seminary that was run by Stowe's father. She started writing short stories in the 1840s, and some of them have anti-slavery elements to them, but she really kind of grew her way into abolitionism, and Uncle Tom's Cabin just kind of exploded into her imagination in 1851. Yeah, right after the Compromise of 1850 really set her off like a lot of Northerners, because it was the fugitive slave law that was part of the Compromise that enraged a lot of Northerners, because it made it much easier to bring slaves, make their renditions easier back to the South, because you got twice as much money if you were in court and it was a successful rendition than if you were testifying against a rendition. I mean, it was like something like $10 versus $5 for witnesses in terms of the success of the case. So it was judicially biased in favor of the return of slaves, and Northerners felt that then they were now complicit with the South in upholding slavery, because they had to abide by whatever the South wanted. They couldn't, if someone came to the state of Massachusetts from the South, they could not say they were safe from capture because they had made it to this kind of sanctuary. That they couldn't do that anymore, and that enraged people like Thoreau, Emerson, Lowell, all the some of the Northern intellectuals. But it also enraged Stowe, who was then living in Maine at the time, because her husband had been appointed to be a professor at Bowdoin College. She was living in New Brunswick, Maine. He actually
went
at Bowdoin. Yeah, he arrived after she did. She went there with her kids, so she was there alone when she was first inspired to write the book. And there's a famous anecdote about how she was in church in New Brunswick, in the Congregational Church, and she had a vision at the altar taking communion of a slave being whipped to death. And she immediately went home and wrote down the scene in her notebook, and then started thinking about a novel that would lead up to this climax of a slave being whipped to death. Of course, the slave was Uncle Tom, and so the novel supposedly fell into her imagination. She always claimed that she had divine inspiration to write this book in early 1851, and she started serializing it for publication in June 1851, and that continued until the following, I think roughly March, April 1852, which is when it was published by William Jewett, who was a New England publisher who made a fortune off of this one book. She actually didn't make that good a deal with him, and he got a lot more money than he probably deserved by publishing it.
Yeah. That as you're bringing a layer of understanding to this text that I hadn't come across, because a lot of the biographical materials I had encountered, she frequently claimed that the book sort of wrote itself, that it was just kind of a culmination of her life experiences. But to talk about it as possibly divinely inspired, it takes it to a whole other level where she's having visions and things of that nature. And that's the great thing about this. That's the other thing. I don't know if we'll talk about it. I mean, maybe it'll just sort of emerge organically. Maybe we should even talk about it now. I don't know. But like, what I thought was so amazing about this text was one of the things I thought was so amazing about this text was this ideological battle between empty, vacuous, dangerous Philistine sort of Christianity versus the pure, passionate, authentic Christianity that Stowe and many of the slaves had, and how that particular form of Christianity was really effective at the liberation of the slaves, and how that culture, that normalized status quo Christianity was something that was being used and twisted to justify the enslavement of black people, and how you have that tension between this dull and this rich Christianity at the heart of these issues.
Yeah, because the Bible is really central to her argument, because she's contrasting. I've written about this elsewhere, because the book basically performs a repeated reenactment of the Last Judgment. I mean, if you read the book, you find so many allusions to judgment, and the book of Revelations, and the scenes of crucifixion and resurrection.
New Jerusalem.
And so, being steeped in the Bible, the whole book is premised on the idea of it's Matthew 25:40, which is that, if whatever you do to the least of these, my brethren, you do unto me, right?
Right.
So however you treat the most lowly and disadvantaged is a judgment on you as an individual morally, and it will also determine your posthumous fate.
Well, I think this is a really, really important lesson for Christians in America today.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I think so many modern American Christians have accepted the status quo, have accepted the culture as is, and are forgetting about the
radical, ethical idealism of the Christian message. Yeah, and the other thing is, let me just mention that the Philistine Christianity is on perfect display in the sermon that Marie St. Clair reports back to Augustine, right? He doesn't go to church because he hates the Southern, brand of Christianity, which is justifying slavery. She comes back and says, I heard this wonderful sermon, and he says that everyone should have their place in society, so that it's a natural thing that slaves should be our servants, because that's the way God wanted it, because he believes in a hierarchical society, right?
Right.
And Augustine St. Clair is great because he makes all kinds of ironic comments about how we are so the slaves really need to do it because we are so morally superior to them, with all of our luxurious living and lying around on sofas and smoking cigars and drinking good wine. So he himself is a self-denigrating illustration of the Southern disillusioned slave owner who doesn't believe in the institution but feels helpless to do anything about it, right? Even though he knows ethically it's wrong.
Right, but he does have a conversion experience, and that's a beautiful thing about and that's he goes from a sense of helplessness to a real zeal about changing that situation. And we'll talk about this. I'll try to stick to the script a little bit more, but I think what's really great about reading this book is, and like so many great books, but maybe especially this one, is that it's not hard to apply the themes and motifs to the modern situation. And I think that's what's great for students who are studying this, is if we're to look at our own society and it's like, do we have pernicious institutions or marginalized people that are in the same situation that was going on in the 1850s? And I think that could be a very provocative conversation on a philosophical and political level that could lead to some really invigorating conversation. So I'm just saying this should be justification why we ought to be reading this book in the high schools.
Definitely. Yeah, I've taught it the last few years to my AP kids, and it generally goes over well. We learn a lot about American history and the institution of slavery and and it's a good read as well.
Yeah. All right, I'll stop trying to hijack the conversation.
Right.
I'm really passionate about this book. So, do you feel like we've covered enough of the biographical and historical circumstances?
Yeah, just a couple of more points.
Sure.
One is that not only was there the political influence of the fugitive slave law that was finally passed in September 1850. But there was the incident of Stowe losing her child, Samuel
Right.
Charles, right, Charlie,
Right.
who died of cholera in 1849 in Cincinnati, right. So, cholera epidemic came to the U.S. in 1832, and then disappeared, and then it came back in 1849, and it wasn't quite as bad as the first time in 1832, but it killed people in the main cities, and then along the waterways of the Ohio and the Mississippi, right? So it came to Cincinnati, killed her child, and she felt that she knew what it was like by losing that young child. I think he was like 2 or 3 years old. It made Stowe realize what it was like to have your child taken away from you if you were a slave mother. So she felt a personal identification with the slave mother and the loss of your child through legal means, that a slave owner could dispose of your family, could sell your husband, you weren't even allowed to get married. You had these sort of de facto common law marriages with slaves, and you could just split families. That was the major criticism of the inhumanity of slavery, and that's one of the things that Stowe is attacking in the book. And the other thing is, one of her brothers had worked as a cotton factor for a New Orleans trading house. So he went up to plantations for a year or so to collect debts from plantation owners, and he was really Stowe's means of accessing information about what it was like to live on a plantation like Simon Legree's up in rural Louisiana, up the Red River. Because otherwise Stowe had no experience of the South except a brief trip into Kentucky to visit one of her pupils, the family of one of her pupils, because she worked at an academy in Cincinnati. So that was one of the major criticisms of the novel by Southerners, that she was just basing her novel on hearsay. She really didn't know the South. But the amazing thing is she knew the South as well as anyone could who had read about it and heard personal anecdotes. And she had escaped slaves working for her, and she talked to them in Cincinnati because a lot of them came across the Ohio. And so she had a lot of verbal communication about the institution of slavery, and in addition to her brother. So that's pretty much where she got her ideas.
Well, even if the thing is, that was some of the criticism I was reading in the biographical or in the historical biographical material, is that, she didn't understand the nuance of the institution of slavery, and she was using stereotypes, and that this was a propaganda piece, that she was taking it all out of context. But you can't tell me that some of these stories weren't based in reality, and if any of them are true, even if any of these stories that were included in Uncle Tom's story, Uncle Tom's Cabin, did occur, and even if they were a minority of situations, it still is an incredibly strong case for the termination for the institution of slavery.
Yeah.
I mean, even if it happened one time.
Yeah. Well, she also had documentary evidence. She read Theodore Dwight Weld's Slavery as It Is in 1839, which he collected information from Southern newspapers for use. He was working for John Quincy Adams in Washington, who was trying to get rid of the gag rule about not being able to argue about slavery in Congress. So Weld collected, he made a book out of all of these horrific stories about slave mistreatment
Right.
And published it in 1839. Stowe read it carefully, and she also read slave memoirs. Thomas Bibb, Josiah Hansen. She read Frederick Douglass's narrative. So she had fugitive slave or ex-slaves' testimony of their experiences on plantations, and one of them claimed to be the original Uncle Tom, and he made some money actually after the Civil War.
Is this the one in Indiana?
Yeah, I think it was in Indiana. I think it was Josiah Henson, whose story was somewhat similar to Uncle Tom's in that he was so dedicated to his master that he was willing to go into the free state, I think it was Ohio, and to pay some money and then go back into slavery without trying to escape and taking money along with him. So he was a totally a dedicated slave who was loyal to his master, just like Uncle Tom is loyal to Mr. Shelby and refuses to run away when he's sold to Haley, the slave trader, in the beginning of the novel.
Well, you know what's interesting is that these more ghastly episodes that Harriet Beecher Stowe picks out, such as the death of Uncle Tom and how dramatic that is. I'm not even sure if that's the worst part about the institution of slavery. It's the duller, less dramatic episodes where everybody is kept in a state of ignorance and dependence and servileness. It's a crime against humanity to not at least. I would have been an abolitionist. It's pretty obvious that if I had been alive at that time, I would have been a zealot abolitionist. But just
a couple of the
how uneducated how uneducated the slaves were, and how they weren't taught very simple things, and even though they may not have been beaten, to be deprived of a modicum of the education that the white people had, I find that to be a crime against humanity when they could have easily done it. There were so many people around to teach them how to read and read the Bible and read other sources of literature.
Of course, like Nat Turner, 1831 in Southampton, Virginia, led the most deadly slave revolt of the 19th century, killed somewhat, I think upwards of 60 whites, and the excuse for banning black education was, Nat Turner was well versed in the Bible. He was well read. He was a prophet, and they thought, well, this is what happens if you educate a slave. He's going to He's either going to develop, be better organizational skills to lead a revolt, or he's going to look at the Bible and start pointing to the Old Testament and saying, "This is what you got." Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a sense of dignity that comes with that too, right? If you're just like, I can reason and write and talk just as well as the white man, you start to see there's no difference. Well, there's no material. I mean, there's no real difference between you and I. We're just shades of skin tone.
Uncle Tom, though, is given the opportunity to learn to read, right? Remember up in the Shelby plantation, George Shelby, the son, helps him with his reading skills. He reads aloud from the Bible. He does that again with Eva St. Clair in New Orleans, where he is reading together with her. So this is the mild, more tolerant form of slavery that Stowe acknowledged could exist in the South, but there was always the threat of sale in the background, right? Just like Mr. Shelby has to sell slaves because he gets into debt. Augustine St. Clair's slaves have to be sold because he dies in a barroom brawl, and his wife is too callous to care to either liberate or find a kindly master for the slaves of the household to go to, like Tom. That's why he ends up with Simon Legree.
Right. Well, and I don't know. The other thing that bugs me about Uncle Tom's Cabin, or maybe just the name Uncle Tom.
Yeah.
Like, I hear that thrown around as a pejorative
term.
Yeah, but Uncle Tom, to me, as a Christian, is a heroic figure.
Yeah.
To me, to Luke Johnson. I don't know what you think about it, but to me, he does imitate Christ in the sense that he will not unlike the slaves on the plantation, like Sambo and the other individuals who've been given a taste of power so they can subjugate the other slaves and stuff like that. He refuses to do wrong, and he suffers great consequences for it and eventually dies, right? And the entire time while he's doing this, he's giving a testimony that it's his faith in Jesus Christ that allows him to endure these trials and tribulations. And then ultimately that is a contribution politically and spiritually towards the emancipation of slaves, because you can see that in the conversion of St. Clair. Like after that happens, right, he pledges his life to the anti-slavery cause. And I think this is why I love this text so much, because it shows how Christianity can really how it really ought to be evolved in political movements, and not like we've talked in other situations where there's this dominionism, this sort of manifest destiny with Christianity, but more about looking out for the weakest of society. And that's so Uncle Tom to me is not some sort of servile, yes, master, I'll do whatever you say. Like he ultimately ends up in his own way helping to defeat the institution of slavery.
Yeah.
He was a major player in that.
Yeah. Well, I think the term Uncle Tom developed a pejorative meaning for African Americans in the early 20th century because they'd seen Stowe's novel. They knew it more from its post-Civil War reputation, when it was the subject of all kinds of traveling shows, minstrel shows, entertainments, and so the anti-slavery element had gotten cheapened, or even there are even pro-slavery versions of Uncle Tom's Cabin, a dramatic rewrite. So and he became caricatured as the subservient black man because that is the easiest way to look at him. You know, it means ignoring the message of the novel, which is, you know, a passionate depiction of him as a principled human being, superior to everyone around him. And it also led to a change in his character because the general public thought of him as an older guy who was sort of verging on, sort of a grandfatherly figure, rather than being a virile guy in his 30s who had several children with Chloe, his wife. And uncle and aunt were just sort of, those were the terms that were used as affectionate endearments to slaves who were part of the household, right? So uncle and aunt doesn't mean anything. They're no one's uncle and aunt. It was just an affectionate term for a sort of household surrogate who happened to be a slave as well. Yeah. And so the caricature of Uncle Tom in the 20th century was based on reaction to the cheap commercialization of Stowe's fiction in these dramatic forms, in these traveling shows that, I mean, you just can't believe what happened after the Civil War, because you would have these hundreds and hundreds of these traveling shows who are reenacting Uncle Tom's Cabin in all kinds of forms. In theater,
where like a lot of blackface and stuff.
Yeah, some of them do in minstrel array, and some of them with elephants and lions. I mean, it was almost like a circus combined with Stowe's novel, because it became such a phenomenal cultural event.
I should go back. I was telling Dr. Cook off the air, I recorded all the primary source materials that I could find in the JSTOR early journal content, except for one. It was a court case, and I'm starting to think now that the court case was more about how Stowe lost control of the characters when they entered into the public domain. And I think I don't know if you have anything on this, but I think she may have even been able to see some of the permutations where they were bastardizing the character of Uncle Tom, and I think she was really upset by it. But I guess I think the court ruled that people were allowed to do this. Once you release them into the world.
You could pretty much do whatever you wanted with her story in a dramatic form.
Do you know if she saw that? Do you know?
I think she actually allowed one black actress to perform Uncle Tom's Cabin herself as a sort of solo performer in the theater, but in Stowe's world, in this evangelical Christian world, women were really not supposed to go to the theater, which still had a bad reputation as being the place where prostitutes would hang out on the upper levels, and where cheap entertainment was on tap, and so she really did not see much of these. I guess you call them bastardizations. I mean, there was one Uncle Tom's adaptation that tried to be pretty faithful to the book fairly soon after it came out, and that had a pretty long run in New York and other major cities. But there were other versions that came out, including one that had a sort of pro-slavery bias to it. So after the Civil War, there was less need for the country to somehow find a way to get rid of slavery, right? So they could look back on the novel and heighten its caricature, try to caricature the black characters there by depicting them as sort of minstrel performers, because abolition had already happened, right? And now there was a reaction from the South that was amounted to the idea that yes, we had to liberate our slaves, but that didn't mean that we would give them rights or treat them as human beings. We would still segregate them and discriminate against them and kill them once in a while with lynchings. So it was really it was a very different world after the Civil War for the novel, but the novel itself had a huge impact on northern white audiences that put them into a frame of mind that was much more critical of slavery than they would have ever been, because they never went to an abolitionist lecture, right? They wouldn't do that, but they would stay home and read Uncle Tom's Cabin and be persuaded by her arguments. So the number of people who were sympathetic to abolitionism increased steadily after her book was published, beyond the narrow confines of the official movement.
It's really incredible how a book can do that. Just a little bit of information and a little bit of an argument that gets put out there. I think we're seeing that today in some ways. What was really interesting also about this book is that it wasn't unilateral. It wasn't a unilateral critique of the Southern slaveholders. It was also a critique of the North, which I thought to be a really profound wrinkle that I'd never really thought of before, because the Northerners could quite easily condemn the institution of slavery, but they weren't really looking in the mirror and asking themselves what they could do to be part of the solution. They weren't really, before the Civil War, they weren't really asking themselves, well, are we prepared to hire slaves that escape? Are we prepared to educate slaves that escape? Or if there were a massive emancipation, do we have the institutions in place to suddenly take care of 4 million? Is that right? 4 million new citizens?
More like 3 million, I think. Slaves
or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And so it's very easy in some ways to look at the South and be like, you're doing everything all wrong.
Yeah.
But what I thought was really successful about Stowe's novel was she's like, yo, North, you got some stuff you need to clean up too.
Yeah. That's at the end of the book where she has a little chapter that is a sort of prophetic reflection about the sins of the whole country, not just of the South. But yeah, that's a good point, because you see that illustrated, first of all, the fact that Simon Legree came from Vermont originally, right? He was a Northerner who went to sea as a sailor and then became corrupted and then ended up in the South as a slaveholder and a plantation owner. And also Augustine St. Clair's sister, her cousin, the cousin who was living in his household, who becomes kind of the protector of Topsy after Augustine's death, right? Augustine criticizes her for being from a region of the country that believes in abolitionism, but doesn't really think well of African Americans and refuses to, touch them or shake hands with them or be close to them physically. So
I think there was a episode where it's like, you'll kiss your dog, but you won't kiss a black man.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a telling criticism of her, and so yeah. That,
well, we should stick to the questions that are more rooted in the specifics of the novel. Yeah. I have all these major philosophical questions I want to ask about it, but you mentioned something about there being a double plot to the novel.
Yeah, I mean, because the book is so effective in giving you a very broad exposure to the realities of slavery and the situation of slaves. You have, we start out on a plantation in Kentucky, the Shelbys, and then we immediately are launched into the following Eliza Harris's escape with her child, Harry, because of the threat to him, the child, to go along with, to be thrown in with Uncle Tom as the amount of money that was owed to Haley has to be made up somehow, and so Uncle Tom and this child will be sold as slaves. So Eliza escapes, and she knows that her husband, George, has already vowed to run away, and both of them are going to be making their way up to Canada, right? So that's going to be one storyline, and then the other storyline is the story of Tom being sold down the river, so to speak, with Haley, who's going to take him on riverboats down the Ohio and then down to New Orleans. So, you sort of have this movement of characters going north and south. The northern headed characters have a much more exciting story initially because they're being chased as fugitives, right? And they're given assistance to people up in Ohio, and they eventually make it to the shores of Lake Erie, and then are going to take a boat across to Canada because that was the refuge for a lot of fugitive slaves who thought that they wouldn't be safe staying even in northern states after the fugitive slave laws were passed. But so we see Eliza with her child, and this was a famous scene in the right. melodramas that were made of the story. She crosses the Ohio River when it's ice flows are going in March, early March, I think it is, late February, and she gets to the other side, and she's ends up in the household of the Senator Byrd and his wife, and he has recently been involved in some legislation. He's a state senator, not a national senator. He's been involved in legislation in Columbus, Ohio, regarding the status of fugitive slaves. And now he has a slave on his doorstep, who's needing assistance and care and help to continue traveling north. And then she ends up with the Halliday family, who are Quakers, and that sect, of course, is famous for their abolitionist viewpoints. So we learn a little bit about the Quaker attitude towards abolitionism, and you have this, beautiful image of a motherly Quaker, Rachel Halliday, who, her name Holiday is a disguised form of the word holiday, right? In other words, a holy day. She's a holy figure, and she provides sanctuary for Eliza and reunites Eliza with her husband, George Harris, who has made it up there as well. So, and then in the meantime, you have Uncle Tom going down the river. On this riverboat, we have some interesting scenes about Haley dealing with making deals regarding slavery. And there's a slave mother named Lucy who's tricked onto the boat, and then her child is taken from her when she is not aware of it. He's sold to be taken at the next stop of the riverboat in Kentucky, and Lucy jumps off the ship in despair at losing her child. And there's some very poignant language that Stowe used about how this slave mother, is just so distraught at the loss of her child that she commits suicide, and how despairing this is, and how she will be rewarded in heaven. She will have a comforter in Jesus. So it's on this trip that Uncle Tom goes down to New Orleans. He meets the St. Clair family. Augustine St. Clair buys him because he had rescued Eva from falling in the river accidentally, and he jumps in and saves her. So he comes recommended as a sort of heroic figure, and then enters their household. And he is he's not really the center of attention for a while. Augustine St. Clair becomes the focus there, because he is put in the position of a reluctant slave owner, which, there were a few of them in the South, not that many. And he's quite a fascinating figure. And he debates with his brother, who runs the family plantation, because when the parents died, he decided he didn't want to run the plantation. He'd rather live on the fruits of the income and live in New Orleans with a few slaves in his household and be a man of leisure. And his brother Adolphe would be the guy who kept the business going that his father started, right? So they debate about slavery in a way that is very contemporary for the late 1840s. They talk about, the European revolutions of 1848, how people in the underclass were stirring, not only black but white. I mean, white Europeans were rising up against their virtual imprisonment in industries and politically as well. So we get some very interesting panoramic views of European American history from the period in these discussions between Augustine and his brother rather. But then Uncle Tom is sold when Augustine dies, and he ends up with Simon Legree. So there we're back with Uncle Tom as a focus of attention, and seeing Legree's sadistic treatment of him is a very powerful statement about slavery at its worst. So you're kind of going down to hell as the deeper you go into in the South, ending up on a rural Louisiana plantation, and then you're going north as though you're rising up into heaven, into freedom. And the river, the Ohio River, is kind of the Canaan between the promised land of the north and the hell of the south. So it's a sort of biblical geography, you'd call it.
Right. Well, something. All this prompts a larger question, and I wonder if you could just field it for a second. I told Dr. Cook off air that I've been working on this primary source text, Battles and Leaders of the Civil War, and just so I can get my head around the time period, when you have a text like Uncle Tom's Cabin out there, and it is igniting this debate and these passions about these dialectical passions of pro-slavery and anti-slavery and things like that. But on the other hand, so many Civil War historians will say that the Civil War itself was not fought over the slavery issue, and the Emancipation Proclamation didn't change anything about the war. But that's hard for me to believe when you have a book like this resonating with so many people, that the Civil War, when people voted for Lincoln, they knew they were essentially voting for secession and a likely civil war, didn't they? All this had to be in the atmosphere, right? How how could the Civil War have not been about slavery with this book a part of the national conversation?
Yeah. Well, first of all, no reputable historian, would ever believe that the Civil War wasn't based on slavery. I mean, the South, during the Civil War and afterwards, made a concerted effort to recast the conflict as over states' rights because they did not feel proud of the institution of slavery. I mean, they defended it. They were aggrieved when Lincoln was elected, but it was all sort of political. They didn't want people thinking that the whole basis of their nation state was the degradation of other human beings. They wanted to believe that it was their rights that they were defending, right. And so they were trying to put a positive spin on it. And everyone who repeats that line is obviously trying to whitewash the history of times in the Civil War. So no, it doesn't make any sense. And
that frustrates me so much because that's what we're fed at least that's what I was fed in my high school education.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're fed on a lot of documentaries and things like that. That is something that's repeated very often, that the Civil War was not about slavery. I'm like, well, like hell it wasn't.
It just ties into the whole controversy about all these monuments, right? What to do about these monuments around the South to all these Confederate leaders, and how they were nobly they fought the war nobly and they deserved to be honored. Well, a lot of these monuments were specifically put in place long after the war, mainly to intimidate African Americans. They weren't there to honor the generals and whatever. They were there to sort of say, hey, even though we lost the war, we still had these great people who fought the North, and by the way, you should be afraid of us because we're very good soldiers, and we have power over our black population now. Now that the Yankee invaders are gone. So I mean, there's a very clear Southern bias that you can find, I guess, still. I mean, not necessarily in academia. I mean, you really would not find any American historians, even Southern American historians, who would have the hypocrisy to repeat that line. But there's a big disjunction between informed people and those who kind of reflect the popular myths of their time and their place, because Southerners, will still repeat the same lines that they were saying in the, after the Civil War, the religion of the lost cause, right? That religion is still around. Yeah. If you read Tony Horowitz's Confederates in the Attic, which is a wonderful book from about 20 years ago, a very entertaining account of the legacy of the Civil War.
Yeah. It just shows how hard it is for mythologies to die.
Yeah. Exactly.
I mean, like, I live in Virginia. It was the seat of the Confederacy, but where I live, the county where we live, the county split in two, right? How?
Yeah.
Well,
you had anti-slave people, but yeah. But the fact is, when Lincoln was elected, no one really imagined that the South would have the audacity to follow through on their threats. I mean, Lincoln was clearly opposed to slavery, but it was still a toss-up whether all of these fire eaters would get their way, because they were not. They were very vocal, but there were a lot of Unionists in the South who were disturbed by the idea of secession, but they kind of they lost out, and secession happened. Anyway, let's get back to our book.
Sure. Let's see here. I mean, should we talk a little bit more? I mean, she's not in the book very long, but Eva St. Clair was a really remarkable character, and Cassie Nimmerlein. Yeah, I mean, Eva St. I mean, how do you not? I mean, Eva is the one that forms this incredible relationship with Uncle Tom, and she's this cherub from another world that isn't here long, and she imparts these great moral lessons. And I don't know.
6 years old, 6 or 7 years old.
I have nieces, and so I kind of hope that my nieces are like Eva St. Clair in some way. I mean, Eva St. Clair is, there's just so much purity of love to her. You know?
Yeah.
And she's
an ideal,
the color distinctions.
She's an ideal character, and she's she's really the product of the sentimentalization and idealization of children that was typical of antebellum culture, but also found in the Bible, in the millennial visions of Isaiah. Isaiah 11, where
Isaiah 11,
the lamb and the lion shall lie down together, a little child shall lead them. So the idea of having the pure child who is immune to evil because she transcends it somehow with her character really is formulated with those ideas behind her. And of course, her death is a rival to Charles Dickens' old curiosity shop, Little Nell, that everyone cried over in the early 1840s.
I may have cried when she died. I may have cried.
Yeah, so it's a very touching scene. I mean, a lot of people sort of hold their nose. They think they have to hold their nose when they read that death scene, but it is very moving, and there are all kinds of echoes of Christianity, of her as the suffering little child who exhibits Christ-like tendencies and has to die for the sins of her the taking on the sins of other people, the South. And it's her image that provides Tom with his as a reminder of his ethical idealism when he's facing the tortures and torments of Simon Legree. He thinks of her when Legree is whipping him, and he's inspired to hold out against this evil man, to keep his idealism because of the virtual martyrdom that Eva herself faced. Dying of tuberculosis at a young age. She's not being tortured by someone, obviously. But the death scene is just filled with biblical references. I mean, if you read read it carefully, you'll find references to especially the Gospel of John. And the bridegroom coming at night is the allusion to the Christ. Matthew is the heavenly bridegroom coming.
And she gives Uncle Tom hope for the New Jerusalem. And they
read together from the Apocalypse. From the Revelation.
I don't know if it was the death scene that caused me to weep so much as it was to think of this little girl and this hulking black man sitting down,
and they're best buds,
and then being the closest of friends and reading the Bible together and reading, like you said, reading apocalyptic literature together and not being afraid of it, but seeing it as this blessed hope for both of them.
Yeah.
And that's just not something you encounter today. It's not something you see.
Well, you see it, in Shirley Temple movies.
I guess.
But it's amazing because both of them are very evangelical. I mean, Eva's name, Eveline St. Clair, so the name suggests the evangels, expresses the idea of Eve as the mother of humanity, right? So she has this kind of dual identity as embodying the the evangelical Christian ideal of conversion, and also Eve as the original mother of humanity, the unfallen Eve, of course. Or, so her name, most of the names in the book, or a lot of the names in the book, have these symbolic resonances. Like Cassie, you think of Cassie as the discarded mistress of Simon Legree, who tells this horrific story about being the mistress of, she's a mulatto, and she's been the mistress of several white men, and each of them kind of, for one reason or another, pass her off to the next one as she gets more and more children, until she actually kills one of her children out of fear that it will be, facing the same kind of horrible life that she has as a slave. But she turns into a nemesis figure when she is able to leave Legree's plantation with her protege Emmeline, right? Who is also threatened with sexual slavery to Legree because he's become apparently jaded and tired of Cassie, who's a very strong-willed woman. Well, of course, Cassie's name comes from the Greek, Trojan prophetess Cassandra, right, who warned about the fall of Troy. And so Cassie is sort of there to warn about the end of Legree's control, and kind of extended warning to the South that your time is coming because of your injustices. So Cassie is she's a fallen woman. She's kind of a Magdalene figure as the mistress of Legree, but she is able to escape with Emmeline through this very clever ruse of pretending to leave and then doubling back and going back to the house and then living in the attic of Legree's mansion and then haunting him with all kinds of supernatural tricks to take advantage of his superstition and his tendency to drink, because the guy was going to bed drunk a lot, and he was susceptible to being persuaded that the house was haunted, because he apparently, there's a hint that he may have tortured a slave to death in the attic. So he himself has this on his conscience apparently, and he dies. It's a little bit ambiguous about how he actually dies, but he actually dies of delirium tremens because of his drink, which is actually a big favorite cause of Harriet Beecher Stowe's father, Lyman Beecher. Was he published a famous book of temperance lectures, and so temperance, not drinking, was a message that is implicitly conveyed in the characterization of Legree as a habitual drunkard.
I assume that he died of cirrhosis or something like that. I don't know what delirium tremens even is.
Well, it's the condition of being saturation with alcohol. It's sort of a temporary mental impairment based on alcohol poisoning.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's different from alcohol poisoning because I guess it affects the mind more than the body.
Yeah, it's I think it's still around. It's characteristic of heavy drinkers. If they overdo it, sometimes they can just go crazy and have all kinds of visions and push themselves to death at some point. So that's Cassie's name, and also the name Simon Legree. Actually, Harriet Beecher Stowe kind of got it from Le Garret. It was a French name. Hugh Le Garret was a Southern politician, and he wasn't happy about having his name used to be the basis for her villain, and he expressed that. But Legree is not anything that transparently allegorical, unlike Cassie. There's also an interesting association with the name George, because George Shelby is the son of the original owner, who comes down to arrive with the money to buy Tom back, to buy him his freedom, as he was promised when he was sold to Haley in the beginning of the novel. And George Shelby is the son of Tom's original owner, and he arrives just after Tom's death, claims the body, and actually knocks Haley down, who, when he makes some nasty remarks about, Tom's, he was sort of surprised that George Shelby was interested in retrieving Tom's body, because for Legree, he's just a dead Negro. But anyway, the name George for George Shelby, and George Harris, of course, is the slave mulatto who escapes north with his wife Eliza. The championship of the name George, of course, ties in with the idea of George Washington as the nation's hero. So it's got a positive valence based on the association with our founding father.
So I take it that, just trying to get back in time here, that this is considered a novel of domesticity.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about that at the beginning. It was that's the reason it's sold so phenomenally, because domestic novels were really the bestsellers of the time. Because Stowe's novel, it sold 300,000 copies the first year, and then just kept selling and selling, and it turned into the historic bestseller of the 19th century. But before that, there was a novel called Wide, Wide World, a domestic novel from, I think, a year before.
Does that just mean by a domestic novel just means that it's something that women were just eating up? Is that what that means?
Well, domestic means it's written by women for women.
Why is this a woman's book? I guess the answer should be obvious, but it's also not obvious to me. Why would we even consider it a woman's book?
Well, because it's written by a woman, and it glorifies this home as a sanctuary, specifically Uncle Tom's Cabin. The very name of the book is based on his cabin as a place where Tom and Chloe and their children were happy and singing hymns together and reading from the Bible and having some good food. So it idealizes the home as a sanctuary from the corrupt values of the marketplace. So the home is the place where women rule. There was a very segregated idea about the role of men and women, and domesticity was the ideal for women because they were in charge of the education of the children, they were in charge of cooking, they were in charge of management of the home, but it was a home that was a source of values of love and humanity and affection for your family. Was it very unusual for a man to read this book at the time?
No.
Everyone read it, but it was designed. It was a combination of the fact that it was a topical book that everyone was thinking about at the time, slavery, right? But also a novel that women could read and they would have their heartstrings pulled. So the idea of crying over the death of little Eva, or the threat to Eliza escaping over the ice.
Right.
These were things that specifically appealed to women readers because they touched on women's issues. Also, you have very strong female characters like Eliza rescuing her child, insisting she's going to save her child and escape before she would let it be sold with Tom to the slave trader Haley. Cassie, a strong mulatto woman who commands Legree's will. She has kind of power over him, and he's afraid of her because she has such a strong willpower. So you have issues with women who are strong characters, who are resisting the moral degradation of slavery. Cassie is protecting Emmeline from Simon Legree's clutches, and and of course Eva St. Clair is the perfect female child. So all of these figures sort of glorify domesticity. Plus, Augustine St. Clair's household. You have Dinah the cook, whose kitchen is a total mess, but she knows where everything is. So you have a kind of humorous glorification of Dinah's ability to cook the most amazing meals for the household. So his household is run in a sort of very benevolent manner, even though his servants some of them are stealing his clothes, and his cook is putting all kinds of odds and ends in the drawers where they shouldn't be. So there's a humorous depiction of the domestic ideal with Augustine St. Clair. Also, Rachel Halliday, the Quakeress that Eliza and George Harris flee to, is yet another depiction of home as a sanctuary where people are protected, they feel safe, they can have these delicious meals, and kind of, when Eliza has a tea with her husband George and Rachel Halliday, it's almost like a communion. If you read the language, it's almost like they're having Holy Communion, drinking their little tea together. So all of this consistently glorifies women and their role as guarantors of moral values, just like Mrs. Bird, the senator's wife, insists that they take in Eliza, right, and give her the clothes that they have left over from her son's clothes to Eliza's son, which shows that they are sympathizing with that message of helping even the lowliest, most needy people. So that's why it's considered a domestic novel. And of course, Stowe went on to write other novels that usually sold well, and she had a later reputation as a domestic novelist who fit into this genre of women's writing, which is now so championed in academia because it was neglected for a long time before this.
Right. So, we've covered a lot of the societal factors, a lot of the virtues of the text that made this a bestseller and so influential. Did we leave anything out as a possible explanation about why this skyrocketed and had such an effect on the American psyche?
No, I think we've covered most of it. It's there's just, I think what you get from reading the book is there's a very strong feeling of sympathy of the characters. There's a real humanitarian feeling that comes through from reading this book, and there's some real humor as well. Even humor that is based on minstrel show stereotypes. Some of the black characters who are on the Shelby plantation are repeating jokes that you would find in the minstrel shows of the time. So it's got this, the value of the book is it presents a sort of encyclopedic view of slavery and American history at a particular time in, say, the 1840s or early 1850s. And that's why after the Civil War, John DeForest actually considered it as the great American novel. That term was actually invented by John DeForest in an article for the Nation magazine, and his first candidate for the great American novel was Uncle Tom's Cabin. I mean, so he invented the term, and he suggested that was the book that fit it, although he wasn't saying that other books couldn't aspire to that merit as well.
You've talked a little bit about the afterlife of this novel in regards to our modern contemporary context, but what about 20, 30, 40, 50 years after its release?
Yeah.
What about that? I don't know if we've talked about that as much.
Well, as we said, it had an amazing afterlife in drama. At least 2 or 3 different dramatic adaptations were going within a couple of years, and after the Civil War, it was revived again as a popular entertainment. But it was also commercialized, and you had all kinds of commercial adaptations, so that you had figurines of Uncle Tom or Eva. You had placemats and dinnerware with pictures of the family. So at this point, before the war, all of this, some of this was happening, and it was in the cause of the anti-slavery movement. After the war, it was because these characters had become endeared to the public, just like Dickens's characters were so well known throughout the 19th century. Mr. Pickwick and Little Nell of the Old Curiosity Shop. I mean, just like Uncle Tom's Cabin, these names were very familiar to the average American at the time, and there was a whole kind of commercial culture based on it, dramatic, pictorial, and that sort of to fade away in the beginning of the 20th century, but it was still going strong throughout the 19th, and then the sales of her book kind of dipped a bit after World War I, and she was kind of in bad repute for a little while in the 1930s and 40s. And black writers were attacking her, like James Baldwin wrote a famous essay saying that, complaining about the racial stereotypes. And there was a book by a white academic called Goodbye to Uncle Tom in the 1950s. And then suddenly, Edmund Wilson, the American literary critic, wrote an essay that really went back to Uncle Tom's Cabin and recognized its literary values. And then after that, academics started rereading the book and realized just how important it was, and how it was quite an accomplished literary creation. So now, within the last 40 years, there have been just a ton of articles and whole books written about Uncle Tom's Cabin and Stowe as a writer. So she's really come back with a vengeance into academia. I don't think the public knows that much about her, but
they ought to, and that's the perhaps on the spot question that I would ask is, how you think this applies to our everyday lives today and the social causes that we get involved in. I think the thing that really resonated with me is, I think it was very illuminating for me to understand the current state of American race relations. I think this gave me an aperture into that, where we are today and how much further we have to go. And Uncle Tom's Cabin was, I think explained a lot about where we are and how much more we have to do to improve that situation.
Yeah.
But then also, without getting into too controversial things, I mean, you really, I think it really causes a lot of contemplation to think about who is the most vulnerable amongst us, and are we doing enough, or do we feel there's a sense of helplessness to that? So that's for me. Okay. And I understand that that's not going to be a view shared by many. But what about for you?
When you were talking, I was thinking about the last chapter there, where she quotes, I think it's Micah, the prophet Micah, and says that if you don't get rid of this moral outrage, then you will be punished as a nation, right? So I really identify with Stowe's moral fervor, mainly about the institution of slavery as an evil, institution that is just a crying example of systematic dehumanization and failure to recognize the unity of the human race, because slavery, of course, is based on scientific racialism that would believe that African Americans were like a separate species or something.
It's like a proto-eugenics program.
Yeah. So that is what I strongly I admire Stowe for, being so fervid in her passion against slavery. But of course, if you don't accept her Christian moral compass, then a lot of this really doesn't have that much impact on you. And in fact, Stowe herself, after the Civil War, she kind of pissed off a lot of people because she wrote fictions that sort of attacked women going out of the home and having more of a sort of professional life. So she was involved in she was sort of an anti-feminist in the 1870s. Even though she was admired, she was revered by a lot of people for her role in helping precipitate the movement to end slavery. She wasn't always championing, what everyone could agree is the right causes. But anyway,
we can't all be perfect given where we are in the historical timeline. There are things that, there are things that you and I champion right now, and there are other things that you and I are neglecting. And we may think that we're championing all the right stuff right now, but history may not be that kind to us. So I tend to I tend to be charitable with figures like this, because the same thing can be applied to you and me.
Well, she wrote, this novel Dread in 1856, I think it is, which is another anti-slavery book that really gets almost no attention from the public, but academia has sort of woken up to it. It's not nearly as powerful as Uncle Tom's Cabin, but it's quite a good read, and it takes a little more of a radical stance about slaves taking up arms to defend themselves. Because in Uncle Tom's Cabin, the one thing you don't see is slaves saying, we're going to go out and fight a war to liberate ourselves, right?
That was like one of the justifications for keeping slavery, is that there weren't insurrections during the Civil War, and that I think the Confederates, with some success, you're the historian, so I'll defer to you. They were actually able to conscript Negro troops in some instances.
Yeah, well, that happened mainly towards the end of the war, and they were promising them their freedom, but it was a sign of desperation. Okay. Absolute desperation. Yeah.
So you had all these guys going to the front lines, and the slaves were on the homestead. It would have been a perfect opportunity for there to be an insurrection.
Well, yeah, I don't really know that much about that.
That was some of the critical commentary that I heard from people who did not like Uncle Tom's Cabin. They're like, see how docile they were? They wouldn't harm a fly while we were away fighting the Civil War. And I was just like, oh my God.
Yeah.
It's yeah. So anywho, well, I thought this was a really invigorating conversation, and I hope people really enjoyed this. Is there anything else you'd like to say in closing?
No, I think we covered a lot here.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm really glad you selected this text. It was quite the education for me. And to be honest, we cover a lot of stuff on Noetic. We try to provide a lot of educational materials, but I think in my estimation, Uncle Tom's Cabin has to be a priority for any feeling and thinking person. It's that important. I really do think it's that important. So, and like I said, I think it will allow you to see with new eyes current trends that are going on within our culture. So
right.
Maybe it will empower individuals. Maybe it will, wherever there is moral torpidity, maybe it may actually cause some of that righteous fervor to come back. So
we'll teach them a lot of history, American history as well.
Yes, most definitely. I got so much of an education from this book on so many different levels. All right. Thank you, Dr. Cook. We'll conference a little bit about when we'll get together again, and we'll be back with a new edition probably in a month to 6 weeks. All right. Take care.
Okay. We'll see you.